Hello, and thanks once again for joining us for this January 3rd edition of Alaska Weather. Up first on the hazardous weather graphic, a couple of advisories out, both winter weather advisories. They're for the central interior, Tanana, and those areas, the greater Tanana area. That's for Wednesday and Wednesday night. That's for blowing snow with gusty winds, creating blowing snow, areas of blowing snow, reducing visibilities to less than a half mile at times. And that's specifically along the Elliott Highway east of Minto Road. And then the Eastern Alaska Range, also a winter weather advisory there, with winds gusting to 60 miles per hour. That'll create blowing and drifting snow, which also will reduce visibilities to less than a half mile at times. And that's in effect from midnight tonight through 3 p.m. Thursday. And from there, going to wind gusts around the Kenai Peninsula over the, from Tuesday evening through Wednesday afternoon from this evening, I'm sorry, from Tuesday evening, this evening, until tomorrow afternoon, Wednesday afternoon. Expected wind gusts with a weakening system coming up from the southeast. Seward could see gusts up to 35 miles an hour. Seldovia possibly 48 miles an hour. And Homer about the same, a little bit less, fair amount less there, 37 miles an hour at Homer and 48 at Seldovia. And then Cooper Landing could see wind gusts to 40 to 45 miles an hour, both at Cooper Landing and Moose Pass. Turnagain Pass, the same thing. And Hope could see wind gusts to 44 miles per hour. And then kind of a generic wind strength here over the western Kenai Peninsula from the Nilchik up to Nikiski over to Sterling, anywhere from 25 to 35 mile an hour in the wind gusts there. So nothing damaging expected by any means, not even advisory level wind gusts there, but see a pickup in the winds overnight tonight into tomorrow with an incoming low pressure area. And that system shows up quite vividly here on the satellite picture, moving northwestward right toward the Kenai Peninsula, moving into the southern Gulf of Alaska, bringing gale force winds along the North Gulf Coast today. And pretty thick cirrus spreading over south central Alaska as it hits the mountainous terrain, kind of creates a big cirrus shield there over Cook Inlet, and some clouds up into the southwest interior, and most of the moisture, the frontal boundary, staying off the southeast coast there. So pretty light precipitation day across the Panhandle, a little bit of light rain up over some areas of the northern portions. And then another system there just south of the Queen Charlotte Islands that's also kind of moving north to northwest there to a certain extent, not quite as strong as the one coming into the southern Gulf of Alaska. Then out to the west, even a weaker system out there with a couple of low centers, one south of Adak, another one just east of Shemya, and a pretty broken up frontal boundary there between the two of them. A lot of holes in the clouds there, so really not all that significant out there. Otherwise, just a lot of cold air lying in place over the Bering Sea with most of the snow shower activity and light snow from the Pribilofs up to just south of St. Lawrence Island, and pretty light winds over the central Aleutians that allowed overnight low temperature at Adak to fall to at least 12 degrees above zero, and temperatures in the lower 20s over the Pribilofs this afternoon, and in the 20s over the Alaska Peninsula with light snow showers in many of those areas. And rolling this through again, you can see up in the interior just areas of clearing with some scattered areas of clouds that extend all the way up into the Eastern Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastal areas. And on the chart today, there's that 977 millibar low that's tracking northwestward, again right toward the Kenai Peninsula. And front bringing increasing winds along the North Gulf Coast, gale force winds now, and that'll continue through tonight basically dry for the Panhandle. Most of that precipitation staying to the west, and then areas of light snow, about maybe an inch falling in the Bethel area today. Most areas had less than that. Some areas might have had a little bit more, but pretty light snow covering crust, a wide area of the interior there, but nothing heavy by any means, and that extended all the way up to the western Brooks Range. Dry over the central and eastern interior areas. And for tonight, not much change out over the Bering Sea, except a pretty good light variable wind pattern out there from St. Lawrence Island all the way down to the Aleutians, probably southwesterlies, maybe up to 20 miles an hour or so for the western Aleutians. And that low tracks actually now more westward from the east, and parks itself right off Fognac Island there late by about 3 a.m. Wednesday morning, with rain and wind into the Kenai Peninsula, snow at higher elevations, but again, those winds gusting anywhere from 25 to 50 miles an hour, with lighter winds as you head north. Precipitation cutting off, may not see anything into northern Cook Inlet and the lee side of the Chugach Mountains. Actually, from maybe Kenai all the way up to Palmer and into the Sitna Valley, should remain dry. And dry over the interior with light winds all the way up to the Arctic coast. Better chance of precipitation over the Panhandle, especially on the south coast with that front. And then that whole system weakens and pulls westward into eastern Bristol Bay by tomorrow afternoon for numerous snow showers there. Scattered rain and snow showers Kodiak Island, or occasional light rain and snow, depending on your elevation. And that front weakens into a trough now, but still off the coast, so it keeps it unsettled, mainly along the coastal area. And just a chance of some moisture inland. Then that cuts off from the Copper River Basin, and interior Alaska looking very dry, and some fair amount of clearing possible there along the upper Yukon River Valley all the way up to the North Slope, most of the Brooks Range area. Dry for the Arctic coast with light winds, and light winds continue over much of the Bering Sea, although picking up a little bit with that front pushing into the far western Aleutians out there. And the outlook for Thursday, that front just falls to pieces, so light wind pattern continues for the Aleutians. Next system south of the west central Aleutians may bring small craft advisory winds in toward Adak and possibly to Kiska Island or Amchitka Island more likely, but staying fairly light, especially at this time of the year, over the entire Bering Sea and the Aleutians. Interior Alaska, light winds. Best chance of snow showers over the west and southwest part of the state, and even that won't amount to too much. And look for some light snow on the Arctic coast, flurries and fog eastern Arctic coast. Otherwise, the interior, light winds and variably cloudy with a risk of a snow shower over the mountainous terrain, but more miss than hit on those showers. And isolated snow showers over the Panhandle, basically dry. Increasing chance of rain, though, southern Prince of Wales Island, with that front approaching from the south of the Queen Charlotte Islands. And for the lows tonight, down that way in the 30s. 30s for the North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island, 20s for Bristol Bay, and single numbers and teens, or single numbers for the Kuskokwim Valley. A little below zero on the Copper River Basin. High tomorrow near 10 for Gulkana, and 20s to lower 30s for the Bristol Bay area, upper 30s Kodiak Island, 30 to 35 south central Alaska to the North Gulf Coast, and the Panhandle, mid 30s to lower 40s. Highs for Thursday, or lows for Thursday morning, in the 30s for the southeast coast, and a little below zero for the Copper River Basin and the Kuskokwim Valley, 15 to 25 Bristol Bay, and lows anywhere from 15 to 25 for south central Alaska, except closer to the lower 30s for Seward and Homer, Seldovia, Port Muller, in those areas. Upper 20s Kodiak Island, and then for Thursday afternoon highs, call it 5 for Gulkana, Glen Allen, Copper Center there in the Copper River Basin, and 20s south central Alaska near freezing for Homer, mid 30s Kodiak, and 30s to lower 40s for the southeast coast. Up to the north, lows anywhere from 5 below to 15 above. And for the highs tomorrow, 0 to 15 for the high. Single numbers, though, for the Brooks Range and North Slope, but lower 20s there around the southern coast of the Seward Peninsula. Nome falling only to 15 for Thursday morning. A little below zero, central, eastern, interior, North Slope areas, maybe the Arctic coast, followed by highs basically above zero just about everywhere, near zero over toward the eastern interior areas, and out to the southwest, teens for the Pribilofs, lows tonight, 20s for the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, followed by highs mid-30s for the Aleutians, lower to mid-30s in the Alaska Peninsula, mid-20s for the Pribilofs, and lows near 20 for the Pribilof Islands, and in the 20s to near 30 for the Aleutians, and lower 20s for the Alaska Peninsula. And for the highs on Thursday afternoon, near freezing for St. Paul, and in the 30s for just about all of the Aleutians, near 20 along the southwest coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather for Wednesday morning. Some VFR there, Central Arctic coast, but into the, as you head south, Brooks Range, IFR down into the Koyukuk, Upper Yukon Valley, and becomes partially VFR there over the Tanana Valley, and most of the Alaska Range on down through the Susitna Valley into northern Cook Inlet. IFR for the North Gulf Coast, northern Panhandle, and from Kodiak Island across Bristol Bay, right up the west coast to Kivalina, Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, and out to the west, Bering Sea, mostly marginal, but becoming VFR for the western Aleutians. And for the afternoon on Wednesday, we've got mostly VFR over the western central Aleutians, marginal VFR central Bering Sea to the Alaska Peninsula, Pribilofs, IFR Bristol Bay southwest interior, into the southern Kuskokwim Valley, then up the west coast, and then eastward along the Brooks Range, and again south into portions of the Yukon, or actually the upper Yukon Valley, and looks like the central interior, VFR, marginal VFR south of the Alaska Range, with IFR continuing for the North Gulf Coast and the northern half of the Panhandle. Then that retreats back, becoming VFR for the southern southeast coastal areas for Thursday morning. And IFR still, Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, marginal for the Copper River Basin, and IFR out over the southwest interior, the Kuskokwim Valley, and right up the northern Bering Sea there to through the Bering Strait to the northwest coast. Still some marginal VFR and IFR along the Brooks Range into the North Slope areas. And for Thursday afternoon, Aleutians, almost all VFR right into the western Alaska Peninsula, as well as the southern Bering Sea. Mostly marginal, though, for the Pribilofs, and becoming IFR, St. Lawrence Island, and western interior again out west, and then conditions improve to the east, especially over the southeast interior, with a fair amount of VFR with some areas of marginal VFR and isolated IFR. Not too bad up along the Arctic coast, VFR eastern North Gulf Coast, and the Panhandle. And for passes, Anaktuvik, IFR tomorrow during the day Wednesday, same forecast for Adigan, IFR flying through the pass. Lake Clark and Merrill, IFR, lowest conditions, eastern entrances, and going marginal VFR for rainy, and marginal VFR, especially on the southern entrance for windy pass. Isabel, occasionally marginal VFR, and chance of some marginal VFR also for Mentasta, and a threat of some marginal VFR for Tanita as well. And Portage looks IFR, especially on the eastern entrance, and for Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, 2,000 feet up over Prince of Wales Island. Otherwise, surface, southern Bering Sea, just south of the Pribilofs, northern Bristol Bay, and pushing inland now into the Susitna Valley along the western Alaska Range and into the central Copper River Basin and north of the Panhandle. Icing. Areas of considerable areas of isolated moderate rime icing for the Panhandle, Gulf of Alaska, Kodiak Island, North Gulf Coast, as far west as the western Alaska Range, and then pushing in across the Susitna Valley and possibly into the southern Copper River Basin. And another area of very isolated moderate, probably just light rime icing there for the Bering Strait areas and the Chukchi Sea down into the northern Bering Sea, as well as out over the western Aleutians. And for the jet stream, again, well south of the forecast area, south of the Aleutians, south of Kodiak Island, pretty light flow at 33,000 feet here, except kind of one branch comes up ahead of that low that's sitting on Kodiak Island. You've got southwest 120 knots in across the northern Panhandle. 9,000 feet, southeast 40 across the Kenai Peninsula, and south 40 for the Panhandle. Otherwise, pretty light over the remainder of the state, maybe 20 to 25 knots there, Seward Peninsula up to the northwest coast, 50 knots south of the central Aleutians out of the west and southwest. 3,000-foot wind showing 40-knot east-southeasterlies right across the southern Kenai Peninsula and Cook Inlet into Kamishak Bay, and possibly 40 knots there in the central interior, but that's pretty isolated. 40 knots out of the southeast narrow band there for the eastern North Gulf Coast areas, and the strongest winds still south of the Aleutians. Turbulence pretty smooth out west, Bering Sea, Aleutians, maybe some considerable moderate turbulence along the North Gulf Coast, maybe the northern Panhandle, and then scattered areas up over the northwest. And after the break, I'll be back with the marine forecasts.
Welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service, and joining us today, two more people to talk about the augmented reality sandbox. It's Alana Valaji. She's a University of Alaska Fairbanks mechanical engineering student, helped design and work on the details to make this new type of sandbox there. Thanks for joining us, Alana.
Thanks.
And Courtney Breest, she's the outreach coordinator for EPSCoR, which is the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. It's a program funded nationally by the National Science Foundation, right?
Yes.
Okay. Alana, tell us about how you changed and adapted this version of the augmented reality sandbox. It's a really cool tool.
So Gina approached us with 3 goals for this new version of the sandbox. They wanted it to be compact in a light system that could travel around the state. They wanted it to be child-oriented, so we designed the sandbox to have 3 different levels.
Okay.
It's pretty cool. You can have younger children. You can have high school kids. I guess I should say high school teenagers.
Sure.
And then we also designed it to be more marketable, user-friendly, so that this could be seen eventually in classrooms all over the place, all over the state.
Okay. And you had a big hand in this, but this was a team approach, right?
Definitely. It was a really good experience for myself, for George Stevens, who we'll see later.
One of our hand models today. Yeah.
For 2 other members who aren't here today, Cody Klingman and Austin Hunt. And it was just a really good learning experience all around.
Very good. And this is something that is part of your learning experience as well, so you get to check a box in your education.
Yeah, it's a requirement for seniors of mechanical engineering at University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Very good, very good. Well, it is a wonderfully inquisitive tool, fun to play with, and I hope to get my hands in the sand here in just a little bit. But it's also part of a bigger program, something that we were talking about a moment ago, EPSCoR, and that's what Courtney is here to tell us more about. What is EPSCoR, and why do you need a sandbox?
Well, EPSCoR, as you mentioned, is a national program. We're funded nationally, but we're actually located statewide. We're at UAF, we're at UAA, we're in Southeast at UAS, and she mentioned, taking the sandbox as an educational tool, and that's where I'm an outreach coordinator for the South Central test case.
Okay.
Our focus is on the Kenai watershed, and we are really interested in using these tools like the sandbox to interact with the students down there and get them interested in STEM and also communicate the research findings that we've been having throughout the state.
Okay. And one of those, as George and Eric are kind of changing the contours for us there from UAF to maybe something that resembles a little bit of something more of the Kenai watershed, which is one of your focuses for the study, right? And specifically looking at some of the changes there and how that impacts people and also the salmon.
Yes, it is all of our research is social and environmental.
Okay.
So we have social scientists working hand in hand with our environmental scientists. One of the things we're studying is Upper Russian Lake, and we have a researcher taking sediment cores from that lake. So one of the things we're going to use the sandbox to communicate is how the landscape changed over a long period of time, thousands of years, going from glacier, covered by glacier ice, to being filled with water, and then
that's what they're doing right now.
Exactly. So
live.
They're moving the water around, and then I think they've got some props over there because we're also going to go a little bit more in depth and explain how the salmon got there.
Okay.
So using
there's
these
the salmon.
Exactly. Oh, I think there's a few more.
Yeah, we like more salmon in Alaska. More salmon.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really taking the findings from our research grant and just trying to connect with the community and translate it in a really hands-on and exciting way so people can interact with us as much as possible.
Well, sure. That makes the learning and the science real and quite literally in your face rather than just some boring black and white paper that you have to read about. This is something that people can understand better because it's visual and they're touching and feeling and seeing these changes, right?
Yeah, and get them engaged. And then outreach is a huge component, and working with the younger students, and actually even, working with the UAF graduate and engineering students it's a huge part of our grant, and we really enjoy it.
Oh, it is wonderfully exciting. And so, Alana, you were telling us that this is built to travel.
Right.
And this is built to do more things than version 1. Where can this type of project go in Alaska? And what can it demonstrate?
We were hoping to eventually get to villages that were harder to reach, that you couldn't necessarily move a whole fixed instrument to, right? You need something that can pack up, fit in your truck bed. One of the most attractive parts of this project is that this was going to be something that was used past our graduation point. This is going to be something that lives in the state for years. Right.
Well, it looks like you're well on your way with that. So give me another example. What else can this show us? We've talked about the Kenai River watershed. What's the coolest thing that you've played in the sand with? What's your idea?
Well, I definitely enjoy the props, but we also like kind of building up a giant mound, and if you put some water behind it, you can make a little runway, I guess, and demonstrate the effects of the hydrology by just putting up a dam and letting it all pour right down. And so that could, I think you mentioned it earlier, you could even demonstrate the effects of a tsunami.
Right.
Or something along those lines.
So it's not just topography, but it's also hydrology and coastal surge mapping and some of the coastal changes that we're seeing here in Alaska, and seeing what the smaller changes in the sandbox might do to kind of a real effect of a slosh or a push of water up on the coast. Tsunami inundation mapping, or even glacial dam release, as some has been demonstrated before. So wow, that's just an impressive thing. That it seems like the possibilities are nearly endless with this, and probably even more ideas that are popping up in your head too.
Yeah, as we speak.
Very cool. All right. Well, if folks want to get more information about EPSCoR, you guys are online. You're on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. AKEPSCOR, right? EPSCoR, Alaska EPSCoR, that is. And again, you guys are funded by the National Science Foundation, so more to come from that, and a longer-term study there. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today. Congratulations on your hard work there. This is really fun. And for now, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with this edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and I'm going to go play in the sandbox there. We'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Coastal water forecast. South coast of the Panhandle for the day on tomorrow, Wednesday. South to southeast winds 30 knots. And gale warnings on the north coast. East to south winds 35 to 40 knots. Gale force gusts out of the northeast for Lynn Canal. And gale force southeasterly gusts for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait, with sustained winds, all areas at about 25 knots and 5-foot seas. And then for the day on Thursday, Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, north winds 25 knots, and small craft advisories continue for Clarence Strait for northeast winds at 25 knots. For the south coast, east-northeast winds at 30 knots, and the north coast, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, with seas right around 8 feet. And for the Cook Inlet zone tomorrow, northeast winds 30 knots, 8 to 10-foot seas. Small craft advisories, Prince William Sound for east winds at 25 knots, southeast 25 for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings, though, for the western North Gulf Coast and the Barren Islands, where winds will be southeast at 35 knots. And then on Thursday, much lighter winds for the Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast, east-northeast 15 knots. Prince William Sound, north winds at 15 knots. And the eastern North Gulf Coast, winds will be northerly at about 20 knots. And for Kamishak Bay and southern Cook Inlet, look for northeast winds at 25 knots. Northern Cook Inlet, much lighter, northeast at 10 with 2-foot seas. Kodiak Island on Wednesday, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Light variable winds for the Alaska Peninsula at 10 knots. And northwest at 10 for Bristol Bay with seas down to 2 feet. And then for the day Thursday, Alaska Peninsula, east-southeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Kodiak Island, east-northeast winds 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 6 foot seas. And Bristol Bay, winds will be northeast at 15 knots. For the eastern Aleutians on Wednesday, variable to northwest winds 10 to 20 knots. West 15 to 20 for the central Aleutians. Western Aleutian small craft advisories for south winds at 25 knots. And for the day on Thursday, western Aleutians, south to southwest winds, 25 to 30 knots. Central areas looking at south to southeast winds at 25 to 30 knots. And for the Fox Islands, winds will be again variable, mostly south to southeast, though, at 15 to 25 knots. For the southwest coast on Wednesday, variable winds at 10 knots, variable winds at 10 knots, also for the Pribilof Islands with 3 foot seas. And St. Matthew Island, northern Bering Sea, also looking at variable winds at 10 knots. And St. Lawrence Island, winds will be northerly at 20. And for the day on Thursday, north winds 20 knots continue for St. Lawrence Island. Southwest coast, winds will be east at 15 knots. Pribilof Islands, southeast at 20 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, they're looking for east winds, or for the St. Matthew Island area, northern Bering Sea, east winds at 20 knots. And for the Arctic coast tomorrow, pretty easy there. East winds 20 knots, the whole stretch of the coastline for the Chukchi Sea, north to northwesterlies at 15 to 20 knots. And then for Thursday, brisk wind advisories for the Arctic coast. East winds 25 knots, and for the Chukchi Sea, winds will be north to northeast at about 20 knots. And for tonight, snow over the western interior becomes less and pushes out toward the coastline. Whatever falls, it will be quite light even along the coast as that weak trough drifts to the west. Widespread area of light snow and snow showers Bering Sea to the Aleutians, including Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula. And rain and snow and rain at sea level, snow at the higher elevations, Kodiak Island. Moderate amounts of rain, gale force winds for the North Gulf Coast with gusts 50 miles per hour out of the east and southeast. Otherwise, dry over the interior with some scattered showers over the mountainous terrain and increasing rain along the central and south coast of the Panhandle. And that persists into tomorrow for the southeast coast. Less wind, but still unsettled for the North Gulf Coast. Dry over much of interior Alaska. Some snow showers for Bristol Bay. And the outlook for Thursday, chance of light snow up along the Arctic coast, mainly on the west side, but still some flurries and fog possible all the way over to Demarcation Point. Dry over the central and eastern interior with snow showers scattered across the area from Norton Sound southward into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, Kuskokwim Valley, as well as Bristol Bay. Isolated snow showers toward the border in the Panhandle, otherwise basically a dry day.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.